So I want to speak today on lessons from the prodigal son, and I thought a really good place to start would be to read the parable. Even though probably everybody knows it, it just is good to start off reviewing it, I think. So this is, if you ever want to look later, it's in Luke chapter 11 through 32. And so Jesus said, a man had two sons, and his younger son said to him, "My father, give me the portion which is coming to me from your house." And he divided to them his possessions. And after a few days, his younger son gathered everything that was his share and went to a far country where he wasted his wealth in extravagant living. And when all he had was gone, there was a severe famine in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and got acquainted with one of the citizens of the country, and he sent him to the field to feed the swine. And he craved to fill his stomach with the husks that the swine were eating, and yet no man would give him. And he came to himself and he said, "How many hired workers are now in my father's house who have plenty of bread, and I am here perishing with hunger? I will rise and go to my father and say to him, 'My father, I have sinned before heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Just make me like one of your hired workers.' And he rose and he came to his father, and while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him and had compassion on him, and he ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And his son said to him, 'My father, I have sinned before heaven and before you, and I am not worthy to be called your son.' But his father said to his servants, 'Bring him the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring and kill the fat ox, and let us eat and be merry. For this was my son was dead, and he has come to life, and he was lost and found.' And they began to be merry. And his elder son was in the field, and he came near the house. He heard the voice of singing of the many, and he called to one of his boys and asked him what it was all about. He said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed a fat ox, because he received him safe and well.' And he became angry and would not go in. So his father came out and besought him. But he said to his father, 'Behold, how many years have I served you, and I never disobeyed your commandment, and yet you never gave me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. But his son of yours, after he had wasted your wealth and had harlots and come back, you have killed the fat ox.' His father said to him, 'My son, you are always with me, and everything which is mine is yours. It was right for us to make merry and rejoice, for this is your brother. He was dead and has come to life, and was lost and was found.'" So what I want to do is talk about that today, and try to view it and look at it more deeply from the point of view of how the people that heard this, what was going on with them, and what it meant with them. And if we have time, which I have a feeling we won't, give you a real life example of, I never really thought about this. It happened so many years ago until this weekend when I was preparing this, but it's like my own little journey with this story. So first thing, just to put it in perspective, earlier in Luke, Jesus was around, and he was surrounded kind of by tax collectors, and it says by sinners, and they were coming really close and being with Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were saying, "Look at that, look who he hangs out with, look who he allows near him." And the point of it for Jesus was, he knew these people were kind of outside and doing perhaps what shouldn't be done, and his idea was to bring them forth, to bring them back to God. And so there's about three of these parables in Luke where that's his point, is to bring people back to God, and the prodigal son is one of them. So, all right, so we start out here's this young boy, who goes to his father and says, I want my inheritance. Well, think about that. When do you get your inheritance? From your parents. When they're dead. Yeah, right, when they're dead. And I read, one of the articles I read this week was by a fellow who's a biblical scholar. And he said in 40 years of doing this work, he has searched for another example of somebody doing that and never came up with one. He never came up with somebody going to their father and saying, I want my inheritance now. And so what, if you look at it, what was he saying? And he was saying, on some level, I wish you were dead. You know, and Becky and I were talking about that this week, and she thought that was kind of harsh, but that is. And so if that's too harsh for you, another way of looking at it was saying, I can't wait for you to die. I want my money. And if that would have really happened in those days, most fathers, and this isn't me making this up, it's what I've read, would have slapped their son in the face and said, get out of here and go back to work. They never would have acquiesced to that. But in this story, the father does. He gives him his inheritance. And so notice too, in this story, he doesn't argue with him. He doesn't try to convince him to stay. He loves him enough to let him go, even though he knows that what this kid is about to do is going to cause him big time problems. It's going to not have a good ending for him. That the wild life may look like fun, but it usually ends in ruin. But we need to learn that for ourselves. And we have this gift that we call free will. And so the father never tries to convince him to stay. You know, when Ernest Holmes says, when people say, why do bad things happen? Because when you have free will, you have to have more than one choice. And so free will means you get the choice to make good choices, or you get the choice to make bad choices, and whichever way you go, you're responsible for it, and you live with the consequences. So then the story says that this young boy goes to a far country, and there are different interpretations of what a far country means. And one of them is he goes out of the Holy Land and basically tries to get away from all of these Jewish people that he lives within, so nobody's going to condemn him and nobody's going to censure him. And I was thinking this week, sure, if you were going to go screw around and do something you know you shouldn't do, you probably wouldn't do it in front of your neighbors and your parents' friends who are going to be saying, oh my God, what are you doing, Edgar? What are, you know? So he went away. Now, Ernest Holmes has a bit of a different interpretation of that. Ernest Holmes says a far country isn't a place. That a far country is a state of consciousness. That it's a consciousness that's separate from our good. It's a consciousness that's separate from God. So Holmes says it's like what he was trying to do was to bind himself with material wealth rather than spiritual wealth. Okay? And then it says that a famine came. And I was thinking, well, you know, maybe that's like in our time what we would say is a recession, okay? Hard times hit. And by the time the hard times hit, this kid had blown all his money. So he had no resources to get through the times. And So he went to somebody and he's in need, and he looks for a job. And what's the job that he gets? Now think in terms of these people back then when Jesus is talking to all these Jews. He gets a job feeding pigs. Well, today still, Jewish people don't see pigs as clean. They're unclean. They don't touch them. They don't eat them. So the message here is he hit rock bottom. You couldn't go any lower in life back then if you were a Jew to feeding pigs. I mean, what could be worse than that? And not only is he feeding them, he is so hungry, their food, that slop that they're eating looks good to him, and he wishes he could have some of that, okay? Imagine how down he had to be. And then he says to himself, wow, the people that work for my Father, they've got more than enough to eat. They've got bread and more than enough. And look where I am. Look what's happened to me. And so he decides to go back to his father's house, and he kind of rehearses what he's going to say. And I had the thought, I've never had this thought before reading this. It's kind of like his elevator speech. You know, when, everybody know what an elevator speech is, when, sometimes somebody will say to you, tell me about yourself or whatever. What are you going to do in 2 minutes? And that's kind of what this kid comes up with. And so he practices it, and it's got 3 parts to it. He says, my Father, I have sinned before you and God. That's part 1. Part 2, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And part 3, just make me like one of your hired hands. And so he goes to his father, and his father sees him when he's kind of far off, and he runs to him and throws his arms around him and kisses his neck. Well, in order for a man to run in those days with the clothes they wore, and you women who wear dresses would know this, because they wear robes, he would have had to lift up his robe and show his legs. And that just wasn't done in those days. It was considered undignified. So imagine these people hearing this story and hearing that this father loved this child so much. He did something that almost nobody would do. And he throws his arms around him and kisses him. And this kid starts to repeat, my Father, I am not worthy. And the father doesn't even hear it, doesn't even listen. He turns and says to his servants, bring him a robe, get him a ring, and bring him sandals. And the sandals piece is only slaves went barefoot in those days. So saying bring him shoes was another way of saying that he's back in the fold. And he said, because my son was dead and now he's alive and was lost, but now he's found. And Holmes says God never reproached him. God never said to him, you miserable sinner, you're not worthy to be my son. And when the young boy started to say, I am not worthy, etc., he didn't even hear it, because God doesn't know evil. That's what Holmes said. God doesn't know evil. And so returning to God is a personal decision. And think about this now. Forgiveness isn't earned. It's not earned. It's just given perpetually by God. And so we turn to the older son, and he hears, there's a party going on, and he turns and asks somebody, what's the deal? And the person says to him, your brother's back, and your father just killed the best whatever, ox or calf or whatever, and there's a big party, and the older son refuses to go in. Now, in those days, that would have been a huge insult against the father for the elder son to refuse to go in. And when the father gets up from the banquet and leaves, that would have really shocked him too, because that's another thing that's not done, for the father to go to the son, to speak to the son. And once again, he doesn't judge, he doesn't criticize, and he doesn't reject. He basically says, what's going on? And the son is really ticked off at his brother and the father, and he says, hey, I've been here, I've been a good kid. I did everything you asked me to do, and you never gave me a big party like this, never gave me a party for my friends like this. And the father again says three things to him. He says, my son, you are always with me. And then he says, and everything I have is yours. So in those days, the eldest son, when the father did pass on, would get 2/3 of whatever fortune was, and the younger son would get 1/3. And so in this second one, he says, all I have is yours. It's a way of assuring him, don't worry, you're getting what comes to you. And then he says, for it's only fitting that your brother was dead and now he's alive, and was lost and now he's found. So, if it's a nice story. Craig and I were talking, Craig said it's his favorite story. It's mine too. But if it was just a story and me telling you a story, it wouldn't, it would be a nice, cool way to spend a half hour. But the idea is, how do we use it? How do we live it? And so, one of the lessons in it for us is that we have the ability to turn our backs on spirit, because we have free will, but it's not going to lead us to a really good place. And we can return and be accepted, because God is always willing to forgive. There were other examples where Jesus tells somebody, you have to forgive 70 times 7, which is perpetually. And the example, the woman at the well that they're ready to stone, and he says, who cast the first stone? Who's without sin cast the first stone? And they walk away. And he says to the woman, they didn't judge you. She says, no. And he says, neither do I. Now go and don't sin no more. So it's again showing forgiveness. And another one of the lessons is that those of us that haven't left and haven't done what the son did, or whatever today's equivalent would be, shouldn't judge, because we should be glad when they come back, because God loves all of us. And Holmes says that the universe doesn't hold anything against us, no matter how many mistakes we make, we're always forgiven. And he says we need to forgive. I never heard this before. I'm sure I read it from Ernest before, but it just felt like for the first time. He said we should forgive until there's nothing left to forgive. Think about that. We should forgive until there's nothing left to forgive. So Rabbi Harold Kushner talks about this too. And he says, we need to free ourselves of the idea that God punishes us for doing one wrong thing, for doing anything wrong, that God punishes us. We need to see God as a God whose love is constant. And we don't have to be perfect. We just have to do our best and will be accepted. So I'm going to try to do it. I won't take forever. I had an experience in my life where I think I got to feel what the father in this story felt. So I want to share it with you, and we can talk about it a little. And I'm not going to do the whole thing. I'll finish part of it off camera because Becky asked me not to do the whole story on camera. You'll see why. But before I tell you the story, I have to give you a little background, all right? So when I was about 23, I think, 22, and I got my master's degree, I went to a party at a place, and it just seemed like heaven to me. And I met a guy who was my best friend's friend, and we agreed to get an apartment in this building. And I was like so excited. Here I am, like 23, got an MBA, got a job, and like I was ready to be an adult, to move out and be on my own, which is, pretty natural. So the next morning when I told my parents, my mother exploded at me about, sure, now you got a job, now when you can help us, what do? You bum, you move out, and you're gonna be out, blah, blah, blah. And my dad hardly said a word, and I could see it hurt. So we talked, he and I talked later, and he got it. I was an only child, and my dad and I were really close. And he got, it's time, like 23 or 24, to grow up and start being a man and living your adult life. And for the whole, however long, I think week and a half that I was still there before we moved, I had one person yapping at me all the time and yelling, and so I kind of tuned that out. And my father hardly spoke. And the night that I was gonna move, he helped me pack my car. And it was even telling you this now, it's still hard for me. Because I could see how much he was hurting. And when the car got all packed, he just started to cry, which made me cry. And we hugged and kissed, and we talked, and he said to me, I'm always here, don't listen to her, whatever you need, whenever you need me, I'm always here for you. And I got in my car and started my adult life. So now, way forward, okay? I'm divorced. I have 3 kids, and I'm married to Becca Mundo, and we're living in California, and my ex-wife lives in Florida. And my 2 sons are with her for like 2 weeks on vacation. And Becky and I are about to go on a vacation for a long weekend to Palm Springs. And it's a Friday night, and you'll see why I'm telling you this story now. And my ex-wife calls me, and she said, Scott, that's my youngest son, told me today he doesn't want to go home to you. He wants to stay with me. He doesn't want to live with you anymore. He wants to live with me. And I can't tell you what that did, how much it hurt. And I mean, I had raised him, I had custody of him, and now he goes, he wasn't even there a week, and he wants to not come home to me. And so we talked some more, and she said, and I don't think you want to try to talk him out of it. And she said, so if you want to talk to him, you won't be able to talk to him tomorrow anyway, because I'm taking him all to Disney. And so the next day we leave for this vacation. And this is like a part of the story, you'll see why. Becky doesn't know how to swim. And so we're in Palm Springs, and we're in this hotel, and it's hot, it's in the summertime. Most people don't go to Palm Springs in the summer, but when you're a minister, you do. And so we're by the pool, and we're the only 2 people by the pool. And she's by the deep water. She's just got her legs in, and she's reading a book. And I am like so crestfallen, I don't know what to do. So I decide to meditate. And in my meditation, the answer comes to me. And I get so excited. I jump up and I scream, I got it, I got it. The book flies out of her hand into the pool, and I've got to dive into the pool and get her book because she can't swim. And what came to me was, and it was just in a sudden knowing, this is like a big moment in your life. Life, what goes around comes around. Now it's come to you. And who are you going to be? You're going to be like your mother? Or are you going to face this with love like your father? This choice is yours. And I knew just like that what I was going to do. And there's like the 3-hour time difference. So I guessed when they would not be home. And I called, and I left a message for my son saying how much I loved him, and I got it. If that's what he wanted, then that's what I wanted, and I would just always love him, and whatever. I don't remember everything I said, and I left it. And then the next week, when Becky and I go to the airport to pick up my other son, the little guy gets off first. And I looked at him and I said, wow, we hug and kiss. He was like, we were trying to figure out today how old he was. He was somewhere about 8 or 9, right? Something like that. And maybe 10. And I said, wow, I didn't think you were gonna be here. And he said, why not? And I said, well, didn't you hear my message? And he said, yeah, I got your message, but I didn't understand what you meant. And I'm just gonna leave it at that. I'll finish it when we go off the camera, okay? But the reason that I shared it is like these Bible stories aren't just stories. They're guides for us how we can live. And maybe I didn't run out into a field, but I had the pain of knowing a son, at least I thought, turning his back, and how we grow and how we live and how we answer to these instances in our life really determine who we are, the legacy we leave, and how we live. So I'm going to close with a piece that I read. It was written by Reverend Canon Samuel Moore Shoemaker, and it's titled, I Stand by the Door. I stand by the door. I neither go too far in nor stay too far out. The door is the most important door in the world. It is the door through which people walk when they find God. There's no use my going way inside and staying there when so many are still outside and they, as much as I, crave to know where the door is. And all that so many ever find is only the door where the wall ought to be. They creep along the wall as if blind, with outstretched groping hands, feeling for a door, knowing there must be a door, and yet they never find it. So I stand by the door. The most tremendous thing in the world is for someone to find that door, the door to God. The most important thing anyone can do is take hold of one of those blind, groping hands and put it on the latch that only clicks and opens to the seeker's own touch. People die outside that door as starving beggars die on cold nights in cruel cities in the dead of winter. Die for want of what is within their grasp. They live who are on the other side of it because they have found it. Nothing else matters compared to helping them find it and open it and walk in and find their God, their spiritual self. So I stay near the door. God bless you. Thank you for being here. Have a great week.